So I'm going to go ahead and get started. I don't really know how long this will take me, and hopefully time for questions and stuff, but feel free to ask questions as we go along if you have any questions. So my goal here today is to talk about, as much as possible, the science behind what sex is, what gender is, what determines these things. We're going to talk a little bit about sexual orientation as well. So all these things that, are, right now, these are in the news. These are hot topics. Everyone's talking about this stuff. So I want people to actually, have data. So, and keep in mind, I'm talking from a psychology standpoint and from a biology standpoint. So I'm using what I know of biology, which is not my field, and what I know of psychology, which is my field. So, why am I saying the science of sex and gender? Is there a difference between sex and gender? And generally speaking in the sciences, yes, there is an accepted difference, not just in psychology, but all the sciences. In that when we refer to somebody's sex, we are usually referring to their biological sex, meaning the chromosomes they carry, which are on the genes they carry, and the hormones being produced, and then very often external genitalia that may or may not always align. We're going to talk about whether or not these all always align neatly, but that's what we mean, right? So if I'm talking about somebody's sex, male and female are sexual designators. Gender is broader than that. Gender encompasses social differences, cultural differences, role expectations, behavioral expectations, your sense of self in terms of gender and identity, what social norms and rules are for you if you are a man or a woman. And if you just think in your head, if you say, well, is there a difference between being male and being a man? Does being a man bring with it some baggage that calling somebody male does not?
Yes.
I mean, if I say somebody is female versus a woman, being a woman means something bigger and broader than being female. So, and psychology, sociology, most of the sciences will agree that this is how we're using these terms right now, because gender is to a degree a social construct. What it means to be a man will vary based on the culture you're in. What it means to be a woman will vary based on the culture you're in. Even though a lot of cultures have shared roles and expectations, they're not all exactly the same. So that's why we have these two different terms, and I'm going to talk about sex and sexual development first, and then I'm going to talk about gender issues second, and we'll talk about some other issues. Before we do that, though, I have to bring in a little psychology. It's important to me. What we want as human beings, what we like, is for the world to be in categories. Human brains are uniquely adapted to organize things into categories. We use the term concepts. Piaget uses the term schemas. If you ever took a psych class, Piaget is a weirdo. We call them schemas. Everybody else calls them concepts. But we put things into categories. So as I grow and learn and develop, I learn what categories of stuff there are. Like there's trees, and there's rocks, and there's rivers, and there's dogs, and there's cats. These are all categories. Human brains, this is one of our superpowers, right? This is what has allowed us to analyze and organize and manipulate and deal with the natural world as we have. It's one of our amazing mental superpowers. We're really good at this. We're so good at it that we do it too much. And we assume, once we've made a category, that that category is discrete. And then there's another category that's separate from it. And so we want to believe that all things are in clear categories. It's very important to us as humans to put things into categories. Like, side note, one of my favorite things that we have ever done is that we made a category for stuff that we don't understand that's in the sky, and we didn't know, we weren't comfortable saying there's things in the sky we don't understand. So we made a category, which is what? UFO. UFO! I know what it is now, it's UFO.
It's UFP.
Or UFP, right? That doesn't tell me what it is, that just makes me feel more comfortable because I have a category and now I have a label and then I'm good, right? This is what we do, and it's great. But we have to realize that biology does not care how the human brain evolved, and biology doesn't always sit into neat categories. Like, to me, in my life, there is a simple rule that all living beings can be divided into either plants or animals. It's a category. We all know this. But it's not that simple, and there are things that are both. Right? There are things that are plants and animals. There are animals that can produce, energy from the sun. There are plants that eat animals. There's this realm where they go, well, these are kind of both things. And we've known about this since Aristotle. He tried to come up with some labels for these types of things. So my point is this. The biological world does not care about our desire to categorize. We want the world to be simple. We want the world to fit into the categories that our brain likes, but it doesn't. Most of the time, a lot of the times. And this includes sex. So one of the things that I've heard many people say, especially with, recent conversations about this, heard many people say, it's simple, the science is simple, you're either male or female, you're born male or female, there's two sexes. And anybody who's saying that, not against them, because most people don't know, they don't know the science of sex and sexual development. And that's not a knock on anybody. Most people haven't learned this stuff, right? Who would have learned this stuff unless you took a class in which it was talked about? But the development of sex is actually a lot more complicated than we think. So we have a belief that XX means female and XY means male, and you have those chromosomes and that's what you are. And I just want to throw out here, I heard someone say, well, they've been defining it this way for hundreds of years. No, they haven't. We didn't even know about the sex chromosomes until the 70s. Somewhere around the 1970s, we figured out, humans have pairs of chromosomes. Most of those pairs of chromosomes are identical. Sex chromosomes being the exception. The Y chromosome is very different than the X chromosome. It's much smaller. It contains way less genetic material, but it contains a really important gene, which is designed to turn an embryo into a boy. That's what the Y chromosome does. But it's not as simple as if you are conceived and you have XX, you will have all the traits of a female. And if you are conceived and have XY, you'll have all the traits of a male, because it's more complicated than that. So I want to briefly walk you through what happens in early prenatal sexual development so you can understand why this, you're either one or the other thing, isn't really even quite true. So if you look at a 4 to 5 week embryo, and you look at their reproductive urinary tract potential systems, because they're not done yet, right? They're in the embryonic period, we're building our systems. They have internal structures that can either be male or female. So in early embryonic development, it looks like this at the start. You have two systems. You have the Wolffian duct and the Mullerian duct. One of those has the potential to be male, one of those has the potential to be female. You have a gonad that can either become a testicle or an ovary. It is not determined yet. It's just there. If there is a Y chromosome, it will activate, turn those gonads into testicles, which will start releasing androgens, which are male hormones. And the release of those androgens will cause the Mullerian duct to dissolve and the Wolffian duct to develop. And it will cause those gonads to turn into testicles, which will start producing androgens, which will finish the development of the genitalia. That's in a standard, everyday, normal developing embryo, this is how it works. If you don't have a Y chromosome, those gonads will become ovaries. You will dissolve the Wolffian duct, you will develop the Mullerian duct, and these pieces will go on, and you can kind of see a diagram of which bits are going to become which bits. So an embryo has the potential to be anything. This is why, and you can't really, they're color-coded, so this works. I know you can't read the labeling, but this is why if you look at a 6-week-old embryo, you can't tell if it's a boy or a girl from looking at the outside. Uh-oh. Yes. Can't see the screen. What the heck? Look at that kind of presenter am I. Can I share my screen with them? Well, why didn't I do that in the first place? Not sure. Did we share it? Oh, sweet. Don't mind me. Figure out how to get back to where I was. So here, for the folks who were on Teams and didn't see it, here's the last picture, just for a second. So this is the internal sexual development. So this is internal gonad, going to become uterus, ovaries, cervix, or going to become vas deferens, seminal vesicles, testicles. And eventually those testicles, they're currently, the gonads are in the abdomen. Eventually they will travel down those ducts and they will travel down into the developing scrotum, and in normal development they'll end up in the scrotum. So, again, so you can't see at a 6-week-old embryo at the top there, that's what boys and girls both look like. Their tissue is not differentiated yet. Depending on whether there's an X chromosome, once the testicles start to become testicles and they release androgens, that drives these tissues to develop in a male pattern. If there are no androgens, you'll have ovaries develop, they'll start to release female hormones, that will drive these bits into female external genitalia. But you can see by the color coding, like, they have the potential to become either, okay? This is just normal development. And most of the time, what happens is when you have an XX, you get ovaries, they produce female hormones, you get female genitalia. What happens when you have an XY is you will get testicles, they produce male hormones, and that will create male genitalia. Most of the time, that's how it works. So like I said, the Y chromosome contains the gene to transform that gonad into a testicle, as opposed to an ovary. So the testicle will produce the hormones that make the genitalia become masculinized. And, just because I like this as trivia, if you don't interfere with embryonic development, it's always a girl. Female's the default pattern of development. You gotta have a Y chromosome in there, you gotta have an interruption. If you don't interrupt it, it's gonna be a girl. If you don't interrupt the external genitalia development, it's going to develop more female. So female is the default pattern. The Y chromosome is there to interrupt that and change it and turn it into a male. However, this doesn't always work as, normal, quote unquote normal. There are many cases, because you have to have the chromosomes and you have to have a functional ovary or testicle, and you have to have a body that responds to the hormones, and you have to have the right types of hormones produced at the right time. All that has to happen for average, everyday, quote-unquote, normal sexual development. We know there's a prenatal hormone spike around 6 to 8 weeks embryonic development. That's probably doing this masculinization and feminization, or turning male and female of the genitalia and internal systems. There's another prenatal hormone spike that occurs around 4 to 5 months prenatal development, and we're not 100% sure what that's doing, although we are suspicious when we talk about gender and stuff in a minute. We'll get there. So like I said, so our quote-unquote normal is XX means female internal organs, female external organs, XY means male internal organs, and male external organs. Nature doesn't care if we love the categories. There are about 1 and 2 out of every 100 babies are born with some version of what is called an intersex condition, where not everything lined up exactly perfectly. And 1 to 2 in 100 doesn't sound like a lot, but it adds up. If you got 1,000 people, you got a percentage of folks in there with intersex conditions. So what is happening? Oh, this all came up at once, sorry. That's good. There are over 150 known versions of intersex conditions. They can be caused by lots of different things. The chromosomes aren't always perfect. Sometimes you get more than 2. So some people are XXX, some people are XXY, some people are XYY. There are cases where people have only an X, so they don't have they don't have any other chromosome, they just got the X. There are no cases of somebody who just has a Y. Not to be insulting to men, but there's simply not enough genetic data on the Y chromosome to build a human. So if that's the only one you got, that development will fail. The Y chromosome is very small and very specialized. Its job is to make a boy, primarily. So it doesn't have as much genetic data on it as the X does. So that's why you can't find somebody with just a Y chromosome. So these chromosomal issues, and there's some other versions of them, can cause a variety of different what are called intersex, conditions, or sometimes disorders, Turner syndrome and Klinefelter syndrome. There's a variety of syndromes out there that have to do with genes or chromosomes not being typical. If the hormone levels are not average and normal, you will have influence on especially genital development. So if you have too high of a hormone, for example, there's a lot of conditions, I'm just going to highlight a couple for time. Congenital adrenal hyperplasia. This is somebody who is XX, they are female, they are developing as female, but their adrenal gland is releasing really high levels of androgens. So they are exposed to really high levels of androgens prenatally. And that can somewhat masculinize genitalia, although what you're normally going to see is usually like an extra large clitoris. You won't always see, not fully formed genitals, but you may see differences. They've also seen differences in preferences, interests, behaviors, right? When you get into the psychology of male, female, whatever, these are females who tend to enjoy more masculine activities. There is no clear data, by the way, on whether or not they're more likely to be gay. I don't have that data. Many people have asked. We don't have clear data. Also, there are cases where either you're not producing enough hormones, so maybe the testicle or the ovary didn't produce the right amount of hormones, or there's a specific disorder called androgen insensitivity syndrome, which can be either partial or complete, depending on your genes. This is when somebody carries a gene that makes their body unable to respond to male hormones. So you can pump them full of all the testosterone you want, their body will do nothing. They don't respond. If you are born like this, you can have somebody who's chromosomally XY, but developed external female genitalia and appears to be female and generally feels female, is generally raised female, but they have these undescended testicles. They don't develop a uterus and ovary because they didn't have female hormones. They have undescended testicles in their abdomen, which are often surgically removed, but whether you should or not is under debate. So, and we just had our speaker, Jackie Green, who was here not long ago. She's one of those folks. And she has become fairly open about the fact that she is one of those folks. It has caused her life management issues. So she's pretty open to talking about that. So yeah, there's also a long-standing rumor that Jamie Lee Curtis is one of those people, that she's chromosomally XY. She has neither really confirmed nor denied that, but it's a pretty long-standing rumor. Now that condition will make you infertile in the sense that you didn't develop a uterus. So but externally everything looks female. There's some other really interesting ones that, the other one off the top of my head, there's a culture, and I may not be right, but I think it's in South America, where there's a gene that makes a fetus not respond well to androgens prenatally. So when they're born, their genitalia at a glance looks like girls, and they get raised by girls, or as girls. And then when puberty hits and all of a sudden this other type of hormone spikes, all those genitalia develop and they are boys. So it's kind of just understood in that culture that sometimes girls turn into boys. Right? It's just a thing. It happens. Right? And they have culturally just adapted and worked around that. That's just no big deal. To us, we're like, what? How could that be? Well, because they look like girls. How are you supposed to know? I didn't know. And it's not that they actually have full female genitalia and internal genitalia. It's just the male genitalia develops so little that until puberty hits and kicks up that extra level of hormones, you just can't tell. So, when somebody says people are either male or female, no. There are a large portion of people who fall into this category, and the general term is intersex, where there is a combo, there's all sorts of developmental issues, maybe the labia might be partially fused, testicles may not be fully fused. There's a million different ways that genital development can be not 100% typically male and not 100% typically female. And it's not as uncommon as you think. And there's all sorts of rights and political issues related to what do you do with these kids? Do you do corrective surgery to make them look quote-unquote right, which is what has always been done? People are now starting to say, I didn't really appreciate that. I would like to have a say in what's happening to my own body. So that's a whole thing, right, which we're not going to get into here. So any questions about that? Sexual development, prenatal sexual development, what's happening to make that, before I shift gears? So what about gender, right? Sex is straightforward. Sex is biological. Sex is simple. Gender is complicated. Does this mean it's going to be more complicated? Yeah, because it involves tons of social expectations and social roles and social standards, and different cultures have different rules. The majority of cultures that we are familiar with have similar, if not exactly the same, rules for males and females, but not all cultures do. I remember reading of one culture where males were expected to be the primary caregivers, and females were expected to do the sort of external tough warrior protect hunt. And it's kind of funny because the males engage in what we consider to be stereotypically female behaviors. They stayed home, they gossiped, they did all the things that women tend to do in our stereotype of what do women tend to behave like, but they totally switched those roles. Now I'm not saying you can, right? So what makes gender? This is our issue. In the 1960s, psychology believed that gender identity, we'll talk about in a second, what's gender identity, whether we feel male or female, was taught. For a good 10 to 15 years, psychology was strongly of the belief that if you raise a boy, however you raise a child, they will feel themselves to. There are a lot of cases that prove this wrong. If you are interested, David Reamer is one of the most tragic cases in psychology of both psychological malpractice and evidence that you can't just turn somebody into another gender. The short version of David's story is that he was a twin. He and his brother both went to get circumcised. His circumcision went wrong. He lost his entire penis. They didn't know what to do. The head guy in psychology at the time, John Money, who was not a good person, but he was the expert. He told him, let's just turn him into a girl. Raise him as a girl. He'll feel like a girl. If you just raise him as a girl from infancy, he'll be fine. So they did, and they tried, and they tried, and they tried, and he never felt right, and he was never okay. And yeah, it's a very tragic story, and John Money did very inappropriate things to force these kids to fit his theory. But even with all that pressure and all that forcing and all that training, he never felt like a girl. And when they finally told him what happened when he was 12, he's like, oh, thank God, why didn't you just tell me, right? So then he lived the rest of his life as a boy, which was not a super long, it's very sad story. Yeah. He and his brother, I think, both ended up committing suicide down the line, so it's a very sad story. But he was the most famous case of somebody who was given every single societal, family, doctor, every pressure you could possibly get to be told you are a girl. His whole life he was told he was a girl and just never felt it. So that case, among others, as we've gotten more data, right, in the last 30 years, it has become very clear to us in psychology that something's driving our sense of whether or not we're male or female that is internal, that is not just how we're raised, that is not just what we're taught. That said, how we express our gender, what we feel is appropriate to be as our gender, will reflect our culture. If you're raised in American culture or European culture or African culture, what it means to be male or female will vary, and the traits that you take on as feeling male or female will vary. But this internal sense, right, of am I male or female, which if you check inside your own head, you can answer that question, most people, pretty quickly and easily. Now there are some people who can't quickly and easily answer that question. You feel more male or female? For some people the answer is, depends on the day. For some people the answer is, don't really feel either. For some people the answer is, yeah, I feel really male, but I got born into this, buddy. Right? So there's a lot of variation. Before I go into this, I want to just very briefly detour. When I say here's the data, right? The data on the biology is easy because it's there and it's documented and they can take pictures. The data on gender and gender development is harder because we can't do experiments. You can't experiment with somebody and see if I change this, does it change their sense of gender? I mean, even if you could, it's unethical and we wouldn't even know what to do if we could. So I just want to mention a couple things, and I'm not getting into correlations too much, but correlations are a measure of whether a change in one thing predicts a change in the other thing. And if you've taken enough classes, most of you have been told a million times, correlation does not prove causation. Just because two things change in alignment with each other does not mean one causes the other, which is true. But what people often don't mention is that correlations are really helpful to rule stuff out. If there's not a correlation, there can't be a cause. So for example, I might have noticed in my life a correlation between the amount of time I spend sitting on my couch and stuffing junk food into my face and my weight. I find the more junk food I'm eating, the more weight I tend to gain, and vice versa, right? When I eat less crap, I tend to not gain as much weight. But if I was tracking my junk food consumption and my weight, and they didn't predict each other at all, so if I spent 2 weeks eating mountains of pizza and ice cream, and it didn't affect my weight at all, and that was true for hundreds of people, if there was no correlation, would it be safe to then say what you eat is not related to your weight? I mean, I know it's counterintuitive because we know it is, but if there's no correlation, right, then we know there's no causal connection. So what we can do is we can look at correlations to see possible causes, but we can also use correlations to rule out possible causes of stuff. The other thing that they like to do, if you're, is this genetic? They look at identical twins and they correlate traits in them. They look at fraternal twins, they correlate traits in them. If identical twins are way more similar on a trait consistently over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of twins, it's probably something genetic there. Right? If they're more similar than fraternal twins are. We can look at the brain and we can see, oh, someone in this category, do they have any brain structures that differ from someone in this category, and does that hold true over 20, 30, 50, hundreds of people? Now, getting the numbers here can be hard, but... So I just want to clarify how people have gone about trying to find these answers as we come into this more complicated territory, because the sex stuff is straightforward and there's not really much arguing it. The gender stuff and the orientation stuff is a little less straightforward. So I want to sort of remind you of this stuff. Now, it would be super cool if we could scan like the brains of hundreds of thousands of kids and then babies and then sort of like see in 15 years which ones were which way, but that's not really cost effective. Like, no one's going to do that stuff. It's not financial. Don't forget, research takes money, right? No one's going to do that kind of research. So, back to gender. What do we mean when we define gender identity? Your internal sense of yourself as being male or female, or neither, or both, or whatever. When does this finish developing? Somewhere between 2 and 4. So young children, and if you've ever been around a 3 or 4-year-old kid, if you ask them, especially a 4-year-old, are you a boy or a girl? They know, right? They have the answer. They're usually proud to tell you. They are pretty darn certain about it. Right? Most 4-year-olds have no problem labeling what they are. I'm a boy. I'm a girl. How do you know? I just am. How do you know if you're male or female? How do you know if you're a boy or a girl? I can tell, right? So the question then is, what causes this? And keep in mind, when we talk about things like gender identity and sexual orientation, we're talking about everyone's gender identity and sexual orientation. What is the reason that most biological females feel like females? What is the reason most biological males feel male? It's not just about the folks who are the outliers, it's what creates it in everybody. And we don't 100% know. That said, we have learned some pretty interesting things in the last 10 to 15 years. In particular, there's a part of the brain called the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis, big fancy term, BNST. It is in the limbic system. That's as much as I can give you in terms of the anatomy. I don't know the anatomy. But here's what they have found consistently. When you look at men and when you look at women, there's this little clump of cells. It differs in size, notably and consistently, between men and women. What they've also noticed is that in transgender people, so if you are biologically female and you feel male, when you look at the brains of those folks and look at their BNST, it is the size of males. When you look at men who are born biologically male and they feel very female, and you look at their BNST, it matches the size of females. Now, does this mean this is the only thing driving gender? No. That would be an overreach of the data. But that is pretty consistent. The data so far is pretty consistent. Yep, there's a consistent, and it's more than one study. We talk about orientation. We only have a few studies on the brain, but there's more than one study here. So that's our number one suspect right now in terms of biological causes. There's also a subsection of the hypothalamus that has been found to be related to gender identity, and kind of the same thing, differences aligned with your perceived gender, not necessarily your biological sex. And again, of course, in most cases, those line up. Okay, so in most cases, your biological sex and your perceived gender are in alignment, but not with everybody. Is there a possible genetic influence? They did a study comparing identical and fraternal twins. They found a correlation in identical twins of, I think, 30 to 40% for trans versus cisgender, right, which is the term when everything lines up. Is that a massive correlation? No, but it was a lot higher than the fraternal twin correlation. So might there be a genetic influence? I would say maybe. I don't feel comfy with the data saying yes, but that's something that they're looking at. There could be some other things that are driving our internal sense of gender. That said, it's very important to me to point out that there's nothing that correlates with how you were raised, who raised you, where you lived, how you were treated, what you were taught. Nothing predicts your internal sense of gender in terms of family, environmental, and social factors. Nothing. So if there's no correlation, that helps us rule out cause. Right? It's not because your parents raised you funny. It's not because you didn't have a man home. It's not because you didn't have a mom home. It's not because that doesn't ever predict gender identity at all. So if there's absolutely no prediction, we know it's not relevant. Okay, so correlations have been able to rule out societal, environmental, cultural, religious, all these factors that a lot of people really strongly believe are the reason that people have gender identity issues. No, that's all been ruled out. Now, do I feel that we don't have all the answers either? I want to clarify that. We don't have all the answers. But we have ruled out a pile of things. We found some other things that are of great interest. And again, keep in mind, the vast majority of people have a sense of gender that matches their sex, but not everybody. And this is just a variant. Like I said, data is clear that transgender people have a VNST size that matches their perceived gender, not their biological sex. I wouldn't say it's really robust data yet, but it's persistent data. And this includes folks who don't feel strongly male or female. When you look at their VNST area, it's not really either the extreme. It's sort of rolling somewhere in between. So I'm expecting more data on this. This is what I'm aware of at this point in time. And of course, it's not that how we're socialized doesn't matter, because it does. How we're socialized will teach us how to express what we feel. So do I feel male? Do I feel female? What does that look like in my world? What do men do? What do women do? What does it mean to be a girl? What does it mean to be a boy? What does it mean to be a woman? Those are really strongly influenced by family and society and faith and all those things. But that core internal sense of whether I'm male or female is not, generally speaking, influenced by that. So, any questions about gender? Anything you want to know? I feel like I'm galloping through because I want to make sure I have time for questions. That said, I might get done too early and then we have a lot of time for questions. Anybody have any questions about this? Okay. So, this other thing that everyone was talking about, what about sexual orientation? What do we know? What determines our sexual orientation? Again, keep in mind, everyone has a sexual orientation. Everyone. It's not, you don't just use sexual orientation for gay people. Everybody has a sexual orientation. It's just the majority of people are heterosexual, meaning attracted to the opposite sex and or gender. The majority are, not everybody is. So, in terms of definition, what does orientation mean? Exactly what it sounds like. What are you oriented toward? What do you find attractive? Do you find men? Do you find women? Do you find only men with dark hair and blue eyes? Do you find only women with, red heads? Do you find... when people say this is a choice, just to throw it out there, I always ask you to recall the day that you chose who you were going to be attracted to and which traits you would find particularly hot. When you wrote it down on a chart and you decided which would be great. Or, even more irritating, anybody ever find somebody incredibly hot and you hate them and you don't want to find them attractive, but they're still really hot? If I was in control of what I found attractive, I would say, not attracted to that, right? Nobody is in control of what seems hot. It can change over time, it can develop over time, we can refine it, we can improve it. Whether we like the person tends to influence how attractive we find them, especially if you're female or if you're weight. Right? When women are emotionally attached to people, they tend to find them more attractive. Not that men don't, it's just wrong. Random trivia. I'm full of it. Full of random trivia about males and females. Anyway, this is not a decision that people make. This is the experience that they start to have, just like all of us do. When we start finding people cute, or when we start getting crushes, or when we start, whatever. So the question is, why do the majority of people find opposite sex or opposite gender traits attractive? And why do some people find same gender or same sex traits attractive? And why do some people find themselves relatively more or less, sometimes equally, sometimes not attracted to both? Because bisexuality is a very real thing. It's just to clarify. Bisexuals are not people who can't decide what they are. That's not how that works. And also, okay, this is a random aside, but I knew a guy once who was firmly of the opinion that this woman he knew, she was with a woman at the time, but she'd been with men before, but he's like, she's not bisexual. Because in his world, to be bisexual, you have to be having sex with a man and a woman at the same time period. You have to be dating both. That's not how that works. That's not how that works. But is it a genuine orientation? Absolutely. Right. As is, by the way, and we're learning more about this, asexuality, which is, I'm not interested in sex. I might want relationships. I might even want some physical touch. I am not interested in sex. I'm not a sexual person. This appears to be a persistent, small, but existing, what they're starting to categorize as orientation. Meaning, I'm oriented to nobody sexually. Doesn't mean I don't want relationships. This is what the internet is good for. You can always find your people. Okay? So people who go, oh my God, am I the only person in the world like this? No, you never are. Just go online. You'll find a approach with caution, as usual. Especially on those questions.
Yeah.
Navigate the internet with extreme care on these issues. But so our question: what makes people straight, or I like to just say not straight, because not straight encompasses a broad category. It's just easier to do that way. So what is? I would argue this is based on that BNST data of gender. I would argue orientation is a little less understood at this point, even though they've been studying it longer. But the data is pointing to, is there a possible genetic component? Maybe. If it is, it's mild, but it may be there. When you look at families and try to track families and try to track orientation, which is of course difficult because you have to have people who have acknowledged that they are gay, and not everybody does. But there seems to be a small genetic influence, more so for males, in that if there's lots of gay men in a family, it predicts more gay men in a family, but not a lot. Okay? There is no gay gene. But could there be an accumulation of genes that tends to lead? There could be. Again, this is squishy. Brain differences, again, there was a really famous study by a guy named LeVay back in the late 80s, early 90s, that he looked at the hypothalamus, and he looked at a specific subarea of the hypothalamus, and he did find differences in size and structure between gay men and non-gay men. That said, there were some criticisms of his data, and there's not a lot of good data on existing brain differences. There's sort of an acknowledgement that there probably, if there is, it's the hypothalamus, because in general what the hypothalamus does for us is it runs our basic motivations, which are thirst, hunger, and sex. These are the things that keep you alive and keep your species alive. That's the job of the hypothalamus for the most part. So it makes sense the hypothalamus would be involved in sexual behavior, sexual attraction, but the details of exactly how and why are not clear. Again, and before I get into this, there's all sorts of other physical things that predict orientation. Physical differences. Does this mean those physical differences cause you to be that way? No. But there's some other physical correlations. Like, I'm going to tell you this and everyone's going to lift their hands. In women, if your ring finger is longer than your index finger, you are more likely to be gay. Why? I don't know. But everybody looks at their hand immediately after I say that. All the women do. Is it always true? No. But there's a very consistent pattern there. Why? Probably has something to do with prenatal hormone levels that, like I said, that I mentioned that spike of hormones somewhere between 4 and 5 months prenatal. That is when a lot of the areas of the brain are really getting formed, right? Your brain, at the end of the embryonic period, your brain is really barely there. Most brain development happens between about 10 weeks and 30 weeks. In particular, 10 to 25 weeks of gestation. So that big spike at 4 to 5 months, we don't know for sure, but there's a lot of suspicion that one of the things it's doing is, to the degree that we differ, masculinizing and feminizing these areas in the brain that are relevant. Can't prove that, right? Can't track it that well. Would have to be doing an awful lot of observation of an awful lot of developing embryos and fetuses, and again, pragmatics. So in terms of this is what we've got. Again, here's what we can rule out. There is no study that has found that how kids are raised, who they're raised by, what culture they're raised in, what the orientation of their parents in. Nothing has predicted orientation from social and environmental factors. Gay parents don't tend to raise gay kids. In fact, almost all the gay people I know had straight parents. If you think about it, it's usually true. If parenting determined your kid's orientation, we wouldn't have gay people from straight parents. So it just doesn't, there's just no correlation there. So that we can rule out. We still need more data. Do I feel comfortable saying orientation is 100% genetic? No, not at all. Do I feel comfortable saying it's 100% based on this hypothalamus difference in the brain? No. But we've got data leaning that way. What I do feel comfortable saying is it has nothing to do with your society, it has nothing to do with your raising, and it is definitely not a conscious decision that somebody makes just to be rebellious or different or just to stick it to their parents, right? This is not what people do. Same as gender issues. Nobody wants to be singled out and picked on in society for being different. It's one of our core psychological desires is to fit in and be accepted by the group. Nobody just picks being an outcast on something so basic. So anyway, so the science, really, the data is very clear that sex and gender are on a spectrum and that they are complicated. And even if you go back to, and even things like orientation, Alfred Kinsey did some very important work in the 1950s studying sex. If you're interested, there is a movie called Kinsey, a little graphic, if you weren't. But he did some graphic stuff. There's criticisms of his approach, but one of the things he came up with was called the Kinsey scale, and he argued very vehemently. He had, I don't remember the numbers, but basically on one end you are 100% only exclusively heterosexual. You only fantasize about the opposite sex, you only engage in sex with the opposite sex, you are only interested in this. And on the other end, you are absolutely 100% homosexual, no interest in anything but the same sex, only engaged in activities with the same sex. And he argued pretty strongly that most people are somewhere in between those extremes. That most people, to a greater or lesser degree, are not 100% in either category, and that there was a spectrum. And all of the data since then has supported that. There is a spectrum on orientation. There is a spectrum on gender in terms of how male you feel, how female you feel, how strongly you feel that. Do you feel a little bit of both? Do you feel a little bit of neither? There's a spectrum. And this is not something that we are inventing and culturally imposing. This is something that people are expressing persistently and consistently enough that we are researching it and trying to gather the data. And the data is supporting those expressed experiences. So keep in mind that these are separate things. You have a biological sex, you have a gender identity, you have a sexual orientation. One does not necessarily predict the other. In the majority of people, they line up nicely. You're XX, you're a girl, you feel female, you're attracted to men, you do female behaviors. Same with boys. But not always. So your biological sex may not predict your gender identity. Your biological sex and genitalia may not predict your gender identity. Your gender identity definitely does not predict your sexual orientation. So you can have cases where, for example, maybe so, and keep in mind the power of socialization too, because I've heard a lot of people why would they suddenly decide in their 20s that why would they suddenly decide in their 30s? They didn't. They decided they were tired of faking something, is usually what happens. Say, I'm not comfortable anymore pretending to be what society told me that I am. And or I have learned that I'm interested in a choice that I didn't know was a choice. But in the 70s, those weren't choices, right? Those weren't choices. We weren't told those people exist. So when people are saying more and more and more people are doing this, the data is not clear. I mean, the data is clear that more and more kids are coming out as something other than 100% cisgender and something other than 100% straight. Those numbers are increasing. The question is that because there's actually more? Or is that because our culture has changed to the point that people feel comfortable saying, this is something I feel I can explore for myself and I can determine? And we can't know that answer, honestly. I mean, if you were to ask somebody 30 years ago, are you gay? Not publicly, no. Especially if you were a guy. People got killed for that. So they're not all the same. So, as I was going, what if somebody thinks they're transgender? So if you have someone who's biologically female, but they feel that they are more male, and then they are, biologically female, but they are attracted to men, but they feel themselves to be male. Are they gay man? Are they a woman? Our categories don't work, right? Because these are separate things. So, so I'm leaving you with the Lady Gaga, you were born this way, which is obnoxious. Yes, technically, yeah, and it's easy for those who are in the majority to forget how little time and effort you put into thinking about who you're attracted to or what your gender is. Or you didn't have to think about it because you're the majority. But that was also born in, right? So, anyway, I also, if you are interested and you want to access this, I do have a whole bunch of references here just to make sure that you don't think I'm just, saying stuff. I try not to just say stuff. So, any questions for me? We got 5-10 minutes time to chat. I got all sort of gender trivia. And I've never been asked a question that has shocked me. So, I have, but it was 15 years ago. At this point, no. Can't surprise me. Anything?
Let's hear some trivia.
Let's hear some trivia?
Yeah.
Give me a trivia theme in terms of gender. There's so many options. Transgender. Transgender trivia. So we're all aware of Bruce Jenner. We're all aware that Bruce Jenner became Caitlyn Jenner. May not be aware that he attempted to begin that transformation in the early 1980s and then got scared. Now, if you're a young person, you may not understand what it meant to be Bruce Jenner, right? For those who are closer to my age, what was Bruce Jenner to us?
A runner. Cover in the Wheaties.
He was the cover on the Wheaties box, man. He was the Olympic gold medalist. He was the ultimate man. So he did start this transition in the 80s, and he had a career based on his Olympics, based on his masculinity, so he quit. So, yeah, random transgender trivia for you. All sorts of trivia for you. Trivia about males and females, Are there actual differences, as I have a second, between males and females in terms of psychology, whatever? The only area that we have really found consistently different between males and females is in communication and social sort of focus. So there's no intellectual differences, there's no cognitive differences, there's no IQ differences. I still see quotes from people online saying, sorry, it's just science, men have higher IQs than women. No, they don't. They never have. Since the invention of IQ scores, there's never been a gender difference. I don't know where that came from. I don't know. But this is one of the reasons that male-female couples tend to get in trouble because they do communicate differently. Right? Women communicate to bond, men communicate to share information. So, he comes home and she says, how was your day? And he says, fine. Her feelings are hurt. And he's like, what's wrong? I told you how my day went. It was fine. What the hell? Really? So, but that's really the big difference. Do you see some of those differences in transgender individuals reflected? Yes, to some degree often you do. So people who identify as female, no matter what their bodies are, often, again, we're talking broad patterns, right? There's always exceptions. Often tend to communicate in more feminine patterns. They use more feminine communication styles. They're more, they use those patterns more so than masculine ones.